Kansas, a place where the horizon stretches endlessly, where the wind moves softly through open fields, and where small towns live in a quiet rhythm of routine and familiarity. But on a warm summer afternoon in 1984, that silence was shattered by a scream, a single echo that still lingers in the memory of Kansas. On July 12, 1984, Sarah Turner pulled her beige station wagon into the dusty parking lot of Harlan's Grocery, a modest neighborhood store in the tiny town of Maple Ridge, Kansas. A town where everyone knew each other, where doors weren't locked, and where children played outside until sunset without fear. But within minutes, that sense of safety would collapse. Because on that day, her 7-year-old son, Eli Turner, vanished without a trace. No witnesses, no sounds, no clues. One moment, Eli was standing beside the car. The next, he was gone, as if he had simply been erased from the world. What followed was panic, chaos, a frantic search that dragged neighbors, store clerks, and passers-by into the parking lot. People searched through the bushes beside the store. They checked inside cars, ditches, and trash bins. Police blocked off nearby roads. Search dogs were brought in, but nothing was found. Absolutely nothing. Eli Turner was missing, and no one could understand how it had happened. The days that followed were filled with desperation, sleepless nights, phone calls that brought brief moments of hope, only to end in disappointment. Rumors spread quickly. A single witness claimed they saw an old, rusty pickup truck leaving the parking lot, but no one else could confirm it. Another person said they noticed a man wearing a dark jacket, strangely out of place in the summer heat. But again, there was no evidence, no connection, and no clarity. This was the beginning of one of the most heartbreaking and enduring mysteries in Kansas history. A case that would remain unsolved for nearly 40 years. A case that fractured a family and changed an entire community. But what no one knew in 1984 was that the truth had been sitting close to them all along. A forgotten box of evidence, a name that had never been investigated properly, a small detail buried deep in paperwork, overlooked for decades. All of it would eventually lead to the shocking breakthrough that solved this cold case. In this documentary, we return to that warm summer day in 1984. We explore the Turner family's desperate fight for answers, the mistakes made during the investigation, and the story of the person who walked unnoticed among them for years. This is the story of Eli Turner, a missing child, a shattered town, and a cold case that after 4 decades finally found justice. In 1984, Maple Ridge, Kansas was the kind of town people rarely left, and even more rarely talked about. It wasn't famous for anything, nor was it troubled by much. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved at each other from their porches, where Sunday church bells were the loudest sound of the week, and where children rode their bicycles across quiet streets without anyone worrying about where they were. The Turner family fit comfortably into this small-town picture. They lived in a modest 1-story home on Willow Creek Drive, a quiet cul-de-sac just a few minutes from the town center. Sarah Turner, Eli's mother, worked part-time as a cashier at a local hardware store. She was warm, soft-spoken, and known for remembering everyone's birthday. Michael Turner, Eli's father, worked long hours as a mechanic at the only auto shop in town. He was quiet, dependable, and rarely missed Eli's baseball games. Together, Sarah and Michael were raising 3 children. Their oldest, 13-year-old Anna, was serious and studious, the responsible one who kept an eye on her younger brothers. The middle child, 10-year-old Matthew, was energetic, adventurous, and always out exploring the woods behind the house. And then there was Eli, the youngest, the child whose absence would soon haunt every corner of Maple Ridge. Eli Turner was 7 years old in 1984. He had sandy blonde hair, a wide, open smile, and a habit of asking questions about everything he saw. He loved dinosaurs, baseball cards, and drawing little maps that showed imaginary treasure buried under the tree in the backyard. He was the kind of child adults instantly liked, polite, curious, and endlessly optimistic. Friends of the family often described him as a bright little spark, someone who brought energy into every room he walked into. He wasn't the type to wander far without telling someone, and he was unusually cautious for his age. He didn't run off. He didn't talk to strangers. He stayed close to his family, especially his mother. For the Turners, life in Maple Ridge wasn't perfect, but it was predictable. And in small towns, predictability often feels like safety. But beneath the surface, Maple Ridge had its own quiet problems. Problems that rarely made it into newspapers, but were whispered about behind closed doors. The local police department was small and underfunded. Patrol officers doubled as investigators. Case files stacked up on desks and were often handled slowly because there simply weren't enough hands. Crimes that would have made headlines in bigger cities were sometimes dealt with casually, or worse, overlooked. In the early 1980s, Kansas was also beginning to see an increase in transient workers moving through rural communities. Men looking for quick jobs in construction, farming, or trucking passed through towns like Maple Ridge every week. Most were harmless, but not all of them were. Law enforcement knew that some of these drifters preferred small towns because no one questioned who they were or where they came from. But to the Turner family, these problems felt distant. Their daily concerns revolved around school lunches, helping with homework, and planning weekend picnics. Danger was something that happened somewhere else, not in Maple Ridge, and certainly not to children like Eli. On the morning of July 12, 1984, the Turner household started like any other. Sarah made breakfast while the kids argued about who got the last pancake. Michael left early for work, waving goodbye from the truck window as he drove down the street. Eli spent most of the morning playing with his baseball glove, tossing the ball into the air and catching it on the porch. Nothing was unusual. Nothing hinted at what was about to unfold. In fact, if you asked anyone who knew the Turners, they would tell you the same thing. They were a normal family, a loving family, and nothing about their lives suggested they were about to become the center of one of Kansas's most haunting mysteries. That's what makes stories like this so unsettling. They don't start with warning signs. They start with ordinary moments, ordinary families, and ordinary days. Moments that feel safe until they aren't. By the time the sun set on July the 12th, the Turner family's world would be shattered. But that morning, they had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. They believed they lived in a safe town. They believed their children were protected. And they believed the world was as gentle as the slow Kansas breeze outside their window. They were wrong. In 1984, Maple Ridge, Kansas, was the kind of town people rarely left, and even more rarely talked about. It wasn't famous for anything, nor was it troubled by much. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved at each other from their porches, where Sunday church bells were the loudest sound of the week, and where children rode their bicycles across quiet streets without anyone worrying about where they were. The Turner family fit comfortably into this small-town picture. They lived in a modest one-story home on Willow Creek Drive, a quiet cul-de-sac just a few minutes from the town center. Sarah Turner, Eli's mother, worked part-time as a cashier at a local hardware store. She was warm, soft-spoken, and known for remembering everyone's birthday. Michael Turner, Eli's father, worked long hours as a mechanic at the only auto shop in town. He was quiet, dependable, and rarely missed Eli's baseball games. Together, Sarah and Michael were raising 3 children. Their oldest, 13-year-old Anna, was serious and studious, the responsible one who kept an eye on her younger brothers. The middle child, 10-year-old Matthew, was energetic, adventurous, and always out exploring the woods behind the house. And then there was Eli, the youngest, the child whose absence would soon haunt every corner of Maple Ridge. Eli Turner was 7 years old in 1984. He had sandy blonde hair, a wide open smile, and a habit of asking questions about everything he saw. He loved dinosaurs, baseball cards, and drawing little maps that showed imaginary treasure buried under the tree in the backyard. He was the kind of child adults instantly liked, polite, curious, and endlessly optimistic. Friends of the family often described him as a bright little spark, someone who brought energy into every room he walked into. He wasn't the type to wander far without telling someone, and he was unusually cautious for his age. He didn't run off. He didn't talk to strangers. He stayed close to his family, especially his mother. For the Turners, life in Maple Ridge wasn't perfect, but it was predictable. And in small towns, predictability often feels like safety. But beneath the surface, Maple Ridge had its own quiet problems. Problems that rarely made it into newspapers, but were whispered about behind closed doors. The local police department was small and underfunded. Patrol officers doubled as investigators. Case files stacked up on desks and were often handled slowly because there simply weren't enough hands. Crimes that would have made headlines in bigger cities were sometimes dealt with casually, or worse, overlooked. In the early 1980s, Kansas was also beginning to see an increase in transient workers moving through rural communities. Men looking for quick jobs in construction, farming, or trucking passed through towns like Maple Ridge every week. Most were harmless, but not all of them were. Law enforcement knew that some of these drifters preferred small towns because no one questioned who they were or where they came from. But to the Turner family, these problems felt distant. Their daily concerns revolved around school lunches, helping with homework, and planning weekend picnics. Danger was something that happened somewhere else, not in Maple Ridge, and certainly not to children like Eli. On the morning of July 12, 1984, the Turner household started like any other. Sarah made breakfast while the kids argued about who got the last pancake. Michael left early for work, waving goodbye from the truck window as he drove down the street. Eli spent most of the morning playing with his baseball glove, tossing the ball into the air and catching it on the porch. Nothing was unusual. Nothing hinted at what was about to unfold. In fact, if you asked anyone who knew the Turners, they would tell you the same thing. They were a normal family, a loving family. And nothing about their lives suggested they were about to become the center of one of Kansas's most haunting mysteries. That's what makes stories like this so unsettling. They don't start with warning signs. They start with ordinary moments, ordinary families, and ordinary days. Moments that feel safe until they aren't. By the time the sun set on July 12th, the Turner family's world would be shattered. But that morning, they had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. They believed they lived in a safe town. They believed their children were protected. And they believed the world was as gentle as the slow Kansas breeze outside their window. They were wrong. In the first hours after Eli's disappearance, every assumption the Maple Ridge Police Department had about their quiet town was suddenly challenged. Disappearances didn't happen here. Not children. Not in broad daylight. Not from a grocery store parking lot with people nearby. But the moment officers arrived at Harlan's grocery, they treated the situation as serious. They knew time was critical. The first 3 hours after a child goes missing are often referred to as the golden window, the period when the chances of finding the child alive are highest. They couldn't afford to waste a single minute. Officer David Lorne was the first to respond. He spoke quickly with Sarah Turner, who was shaking and barely able to speak. She described everything she could remember. Eli's yellow dinosaur shirt, the few steps he took toward the vending machine, the moment she turned away, and the moment he was gone. Her story was consistent, and nothing about it suggested confusion. She wasn't mistaken. She wasn't exaggerating. Something had happened to Eli, and fast. Officers immediately searched the entire parking lot again, this time more methodically. They checked underneath every parked car. They examined the ground for footprints or drag marks. They looked for any object that might belong to Eli. They found nothing at all. Detectives then began interviewing everyone who had been at the store around the time Eli vanished. But small-town memories were unreliable. Some people were certain they saw Eli near the vending machine. Others weren't sure. Some remembered a pickup truck. Some didn't. Everyone wanted to help, but their recollections were vague, scattered, or contradicting. The store's manager volunteered to check the back storage area. The police searched every aisle, every freezer, every corner of the building. They made employees open closets, restrooms, and supply rooms. No trace of Eli was found inside. By 1 p.m., word had spread across Maple Ridge. People left their homes to join the search. A group of teenagers combed through the wooded area behind the store. A retired couple walked along the road leading out of town, checking the ditches and tall grass. Others knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen a little boy. But Maple Ridge was not built for large investigations. The police department consisted of only 5 full-time officers and 1 detective. Within the first few hours, they were already overwhelmed. Detective Rob Ackerman took the lead. He was a methodical, experienced officer, known for his calm approach. He quickly established a timeline based on what little information they had. 11:30 a.m. Sarah and Eli leave home. 11:45, 11:55 a.m. They arrive at Harlan's grocery. 11:58 a.m. Eli is last seen near the vending machine. 12:12 with Joe 3 p.m. Eli disappears. 12:05 p.m. Search begins. 12:10 p.m. First 911 call. 12:20 p.m. Police arrive. A disappearance window of less than 5 minutes. That fact alone terrified Detective Ackerman. He began questioning witnesses in greater detail. One witness, a man named Paul Henderson, claimed he noticed a child near the vending machine while he was loading groceries into his car. But he didn't notice anything unusual afterward. He didn't see a struggle, a chase, or a vehicle speeding away. Another witness, an elderly woman named Clara Jennings, said she saw a dark-colored jacket near the edge of the parking lot. But she admitted she wasn't wearing her glasses, and she couldn't describe the person clearly. A third witness, a teenage store clerk, mentioned seeing an older blue pickup truck parked alone near the far end of the lot earlier that morning. But he didn't see who was inside or whether it left around the time Eli vanished. Ackerman took careful notes, but he knew these early observations weren't solid. They were hints, nothing more. Around 2 p.m., the sheriff's department from the neighboring county arrived to assist. They brought additional officers, search dogs, and volunteers. A helicopter from the state patrol was requested, but response times were slow, and the aircraft wouldn't arrive until later in the evening. By now, the atmosphere around Harlan's grocery had changed completely. The parking lot was taped off. People whispered in groups. Journalists from the small local paper appeared at the scene, taking photos and asking for statements. The entire town felt the weight of what had happened. Meanwhile, police searched the area outside the immediate scene. They checked abandoned buildings, barns, and sheds. Officers drove along the back roads that wound through fields and farmland, stopping any car that looked unfamiliar. Still nothing. At the Turner home, neighbors gathered to comfort Sarah and Michael. Officers searched the house to make sure Eli hadn't somehow returned home or been hiding. They checked the backyard, the shed, and the woods behind the property. Again, nothing. One thing became clear early on. Eli had not wandered off on his own. He wasn't the type of child to leave the area without telling someone. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't adventurous like his brother Matthew. He was cautious and usually stayed close to his mother. By 4 p.m., Detective Ackerman made the first official announcement. They were treating Eli's disappearance as a potential abduction. It wasn't a conclusion anyone wanted to reach, but there was no longer any other explanation. No child could simply disappear in less than 5 minutes unless someone had taken him, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The investigation widened. Officers contacted gas stations, convenience stores, and nearby towns. They asked drivers if they remembered seeing a child or a suspicious vehicle on the road. They recorded license plate numbers from cars seen leaving Maple Ridge around noon. But the more they dug, the more they struggled with the same barrier. No one had seen anything clearly. Late that afternoon, a local radio station announced the disappearance, and people from neighboring towns began arriving to help. The search radius expanded to several miles, covering fields, creeks, abandoned silos, and old barns. Hundreds of people were involved. But as the sun began to sink behind the Kansas horizon, hope faded. For Sarah and Michael Turner, the daylight offered at least the illusion that Eli might be found. But darkness brought the one thing they feared most, the unknown. The first day of the investigation had ended, and Maple Ridge was left with a terrifying truth. Someone had taken Eli, and whoever it was had vanished just as quickly. The first 48 hours after Eli Turner's disappearance were filled with nonstop searching, interviews, and frantic activity. But as each hour passed without progress, a heavy silence began to settle over Maple Ridge. A silence filled with fear, frustration, and an uncomfortable truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Despite the massive search effort, they were no closer to finding Eli than they had been on the day he disappeared. By the third day, the energy that had fueled the community was replaced by exhaustion. Volunteers who had searched the woods for hours returned home to rest. Officers who had barely slept since the day of the disappearance were now running on instinct alone. Even the Turner family, determined to stay hopeful, began to feel the weight of uncertainty crushing them. Detective Rob Ackerman continued to lead the investigation, but he knew what the statistics said. The chances of finding a missing child after 24 hours dropped sharply. After 48 hours, the odds became even worse. And after 72 hours, hope often shifted to fear. Still, Ackerman refused to back down. He believed something had happened in that parking lot, something deliberate, and he was determined to piece together the truth, no matter how long it took. The investigation entered a new phase. The search teams widened their reach, focusing on rural roads, abandoned buildings, and remote stretches of farmland. Officers interviewed farmers, truck drivers, and anyone who had passed through Maple Ridge that week. They checked with local motels, looking for guests who had checked in abruptly or paid in cash. They found nothing useful. At the same time, detectives reviewed every statement taken on the day Eli disappeared. The witness reports were inconsistent, but there were a few recurring points. Several people mentioned a blue pickup truck parked alone at the edge of the lot earlier that morning. Others claimed to have seen a man in a dark jacket standing near the far corner of the store. But no one could give a clear description. No license plate, no facial details, no consistent timeline. Without concrete evidence, these leads became theories, and theories soon turned into speculation. One major challenge the investigators faced was the lack of security cameras. In 1984, small-town grocery stores didn't rely on surveillance footage. There were no digital security systems, no parking lot cameras, and no traffic cameras nearby. The entire case depended on human memory, a notoriously unreliable source, especially under stress. Still, Ackerman pushed forward. He believed someone had seen something, even if they didn't realize it yet. He went back to the grocery store repeatedly, walking the parking lot at different times of day, trying to understand how someone could abduct a child so quickly and so quietly. He stood near the vending machine, retracing Eli's last known steps. He checked sight lines, blind spots, and the angles between parked cars, but even at the scene, the answers remained elusive. Meanwhile, the Turner family was falling apart. Their home, once filled with noise and routine, felt hollow. Sarah blamed herself relentlessly. Michael became withdrawn, spending long hours outside because being inside the house was too painful. Anna and Matthew tried to navigate their own fear and confusion, but they were children, unable to fully understand why their brother wasn't coming home. Friends and neighbors visited regularly at first, bringing meals and offering comfort. But as days turned into weeks, the visits became less frequent. People still cared, but daily life slowly pulled them back into their routines. The Turners, however, couldn't escape theirs. As the investigation stalled, tension grew between the police and the community. Rumors spread. Some said the police weren't doing enough. Others believed the case was too big for a small-town department. There were whispers that the initial search hadn't been organized properly, that officers didn't secure the scene quickly enough, that early potential clues had been overlooked. Some of these criticisms were fair. Ackerman himself knew the investigation had gaps. With limited manpower and experience with abduction cases, the department had struggled to coordinate such a large-scale search. The delay in involving state agencies didn't help. By the time outside assistance arrived, the trail had already gone cold. But blaming the police didn't bring the community any closer to answers. It only deepened the frustration. By mid-August, nearly a month after the disappearance, the press began to lose interest. The small-town newspaper still ran weekly updates, but coverage had shifted from urgent headlines to short paragraphs buried inside local news sections. Detective Ackerman held regular meetings with his team, reviewing what little evidence they had. They examined the timeline again and again. They re-interviewed witnesses. They analyzed every tip that came in, no matter how strange or unlikely. But most of the tips led nowhere. One lead pointed to a traveling construction worker who had been in the area the week of the disappearance. Another tip mentioned a suspicious man selling tools out of his truck. A third claimed Eli had been seen at a rest stop 2 towns over. None of these leads held up after investigation. As summer turned to fall, the community of Maple Ridge began returning to its normal routines, at least on the surface. Children went back to school. Farmers focused on their harvest. Families returned to their daily schedules. But underneath that normalcy, something fundamental had changed. Parents kept a closer eye on their children. People locked their doors more frequently. The carefree atmosphere that had once defined Maple Ridge was replaced by a quiet sense of caution. For the Turner family, time did not heal. Months passed, and still no answers. They held on to the hope that Eli might be alive somewhere. But they also feared the possibility that he wasn't. They were stuck in an agonizing limbo, unable to move forward and unwilling to give up. By the end of 1984, most active searches had ended. The case file thickened with paperwork, but lacked meaningful developments. Detectives moved on to new cases, and the Turner investigation shifted into the background. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, Eli Turner's disappearance became what every investigator dreads: a cold case. The file was placed in a cabinet in the small Maple Ridge police station. The search maps were rolled up and stored away. The witness reports were sealed inside a manila folder. The case didn't close, not officially, but it faded. And for nearly 4 decades, it stayed that way. What no one knew at the time was that the answers they couldn't find were already out there. Hidden in overlooked details, misinterpreted statements, a piece of evidence that never received the attention it deserved. One day, those answers would reemerge. And when they did, they would change everything. For nearly 4 decades, the disappearance of Eli Turner remained one of Kansas's most haunting, unsolved cases. The file sat in storage, aging silently, along with the detectives who had once poured their energy into it. The Turner family never stopped hoping, but they stopped expecting answers. Hope became something quiet, something they carried privately rather than publicly. Maple Ridge changed over the years. New families moved in. Old stores closed down. Harlan's Grocery eventually shut its doors in the late 1990s, replaced by a small hardware shop. The parking lot where Eli vanished was repaved, the cracks and gravel that once held potential clues smoothed over by time. The world moved on, but the Turner family didn't. Then, in the spring of 2022, something happened that no one anticipated. It began not with a confession or a dramatic discovery, but with a routine inventory project. A new county sheriff, elected the year before, had ordered a full review of old evidence storage. Boxes dating back to the 1970s and 1980s were pulled out, labeled, photographed, recatalogued, and examined for any signs of deterioration. Most boxes contained items from minor cases, old traffic incidents, misdemeanors, small-town disputes long forgotten. But one box stood out, a cardboard container, water-stained on one corner, marked in fading black ink, Turner, 1984. The evidence box had been stored improperly, tucked behind several larger containers that had been moved in front of it over the years. It wasn't lost, but it might as well have been. For decades, no one had touched it. Deputy Sheriff Laura McKinney opened the box carefully. Inside were items neatly wrapped in paper, interview notes, photographs of the parking lot, a small notebook belonging to Detective Ackerman, and a few pieces of physical evidence that had been collected but never fully analyzed due to the limitations of the time. Among them was a small plastic evidence bag containing a single object, a piece of fabric. It was a torn section of dark material retrieved from a bush near the edge of the store's parking lot on the day Eli disappeared. Back in 1984, it had been logged as possible clothing fragment, but no conclusions had been drawn. At the time, fabric fibers without blood, prints, or clear significance weren't enough to pursue. McKinney studied the fabric. It was old, but intact. And even though it looked unremarkable, she made a decision that would change everything. She sent it for modern DNA analysis. In 1984, forensic testing was primitive. DNA profiling didn't exist. Touch DNA wasn't possible. Today, however, even a microscopic trace of skin cells could provide a profile. The fabric was delivered to the state crime lab for testing. It took several weeks. McKinney wasn't expecting much. Old evidence often degrades too far to be useful. But she wanted to try, because she knew this case had never sat right with anyone. Then the call came. The crime lab informed her that the fabric contained a partial DNA profile. It wasn't enough to identify a specific person, but it was enough to enter into the national database. They uploaded it into CODIS, the system used to match DNA profiles with known offenders. For weeks, there was nothing. And then, a hit. The partial DNA from the fabric matched a profile belonging to a man named Ronald Beach, a Kansas native who had been arrested in 2011 for burglary and assault. He had served time, been released, and was now living in Missouri. The match wasn't perfect. It was categorized as a familial association, but it was close enough to suggest a blood relative. McKinney dug deeper. She pulled Beach's records. Then she found something that made her stop completely. Ronald Beach had an older brother named Thomas Beach. Thomas had died in 2008. He had worked various odd jobs across Kansas throughout the 1980s. Construction, delivery driving, seasonal labor. And according to employment records, he had been working at a construction site just 15 miles from Maple Ridge during the summer of 1984. McKinney's pulse quickened. She retrieved an old address connected to Thomas from 1983. It was in Maple Ridge, just a few streets away from Harlan's grocery. The more she uncovered, the more the pieces began to fit. Thomas Beach had a long, documented history of violence, though mostly before the age of computerized records. Local police logs from the early 1980s showed complaints of aggressive behavior, trespassing, and harassment. He had been brought in for questioning in 1983 for an unrelated incident involving a child in a neighboring town, though no charges were filed due to lack of evidence. But the most disturbing detail was this. Witness descriptions from 1984 mentioned a man wearing a dark jacket. Thomas Beach was known for wearing the same dark work jacket year-round, even in summer. Detective Ackerman, back in the 1980s, had never been given Thomas's name. He had been mentioned once in a vague tip, but at the time, with no evidence and an unreliable witness, the lead went nowhere. Now, decades later, his name resurfaced with force. McKinney brought everything she found to the new sheriff. He agreed they needed to reopen the case. Investigators tracked down anyone still alive who had known Thomas. One neighbor remembered him as strange and oddly quiet. Another recalled seeing him in a blue pickup truck, the same kind mentioned in the early reports. Slowly, a picture formed. A man in the right place at the right time. A man with a pattern of behavior. A man the original investigation never fully examined. But the breakthrough wasn't complete. To link him definitively, they needed more. More evidence, more data, more confirmation. That confirmation came from the most unexpected place of all, Thomas Beach's own family. When investigators contacted Ronald Beach, he was initially hesitant. But after learning the case involved a missing child, he agreed to meet. In that meeting, he revealed something that would finally crack the case wide open. He said that shortly before Thomas's death in 2008, he confessed something troubling, a secret he took to the grave. Ronald's voice shook as he recounted the words. "My brother told me he did something bad a long time ago. Something he said he could never undo." When asked what he meant, Ronald said Thomas wouldn't give details, only that it involved a child and that it happened in a small Kansas town near a grocery store. With that one statement, decades of darkness began to shift. The truth was finally emerging, and the name behind that truth was becoming clearer by the hour. The cold case of Eli Turner was about to be solved. As investigators dug deeper into the life of Thomas Beach, the pieces began to fall into place. For nearly 40 years, his name had never appeared in the official case file. He had slipped through the cracks, a man who lived on the edges of society, drifting from job to job, leaving behind only small traces of trouble that never escalated into serious charges. But now, everything pointed back to him. Thomas Beach had been 32 years old in the summer of 1984. At that time, he lived alone in a rundown rental house on the outskirts of Maple Ridge. He worked irregular hours, mostly in construction, and he had a reputation among locals as someone who kept to himself a little too much. He didn't attend community events, didn't socialize, and rarely spoke, unless spoken to. Old police logs revealed something the cold case team hadn't expected. In May of 1984, just 2 months before Eli disappeared, officers had responded to a call involving Thomas at a playground in a nearby town. A parent reported that he was acting strangely around children, watching them from a distance, and pacing. Officers questioned him, but because he hadn't committed any crime, they let him go. There were other red flags, too. A neighbor recalled seeing him working in his yard late at night. A former co-worker remembered his temper and unpredictable behavior. Another acquaintance said he often showed up to job sites wearing a heavy dark jacket, even in the heat of summer. The same dark jacket mentioned in the early witness statements. But investigators needed more than suspicious behavior. They needed proof, something concrete that would tie him to the crime. The DNA found on the fabric shred was the first major connection. It didn't match Thomas directly, because he was dead, but the match to his brother Ronald provided a crucial link. Familial DNA connections can be extremely strong indicators, and in this case, it placed Thomas as the most likely source. Next came a discovery in archived employment records. According to a time card found stored in an old file drawer, Thomas had clocked out early on July 12, 1984, the exact day Eli disappeared. His foreman had written a note beside the entry. Left noon, personal reasons. That early departure placed him on the road at precisely the time Eli vanished. Investigators then tracked down an elderly man who had lived near Thomas in the 1980s. He remembered something chilling. He recalled seeing Thomas return home on a summer afternoon around the time Eli went missing. He said Thomas looked agitated and sweaty, pacing in front of his house before retreating inside. At the time, the neighbor thought it was strange, but not alarming. But now, with the case reopened, the memory took on a darker meaning. The final breakthrough came from Ronald's recollection of Thomas's so-called confession, vague, fragmented, but deeply disturbing. It was enough for investigators to build a timeline. Thomas left work early. He drove to Maple Ridge. He parked his blue pickup at the far end of Harlan's grocery. He watched the parking lot. He waited for a child to be alone. And in the span of less than 3 minutes, he took Eli. The new investigative team reconstructed a likely scenario based on witness statements, the parking lot layout, and Thomas's known behavior. They believed Thomas approached Eli from behind as he was looking at the vending machine. He may have said something to gain trust, or simply acted quickly and forcefully. With the layout of parked cars and the brief moment when Sarah Turner wasn't looking, the entire abduction could have happened silently, unnoticed by anyone. Thomas's old blue pickup, which matched witness descriptions, would have provided a quick escape. By the time Sarah noticed Eli was missing, Thomas was likely already halfway down the rural road leading out of Maple Ridge. Investigators found that Thomas moved out of Maple Ridge shortly after Eli disappeared. He relocated frequently over the next 2 decades, never staying in one place long. He bounced between small towns, took short-term jobs, and avoided forming connections. It was as if he had been running from something. Now it was clear what that something was. With the evidence pointing overwhelmingly toward him, the cold case team contacted the Turner family. After nearly 4 decades of unanswered questions, they were finally given a name that had never been on their radar, a man they didn't know, a stranger who had walked among them unnoticed. Thomas Beach was identified as the prime and only suspect in the abduction and death of Eli Turner. Though Thomas had died in 2008, investigators knew they had finally uncovered the truth. The threads of the case, the blue truck, the dark jacket, the fabric fragment, the confession, the timeline, all aligned to reveal what had happened. And now, with the suspect identified, there was one final step: reconstructing the last moments of Eli's life and giving the Turner family the answers they deserved. Once investigators confirmed Thomas Beach as the prime suspect, the cold case team moved toward the final step, officially closing the case. It wasn't the ending anyone had hoped for, but it was an ending grounded in truth, something the Turner family had been denied for nearly 40 years. The official findings were compiled into a detailed report. It included the DNA evidence, the new witness statements, Thomas's employment records, his past behavior, and the timeline that placed him at Harlan's grocery on the day Eli vanished. It was a comprehensive document that connected every critical detail. the sheriff's department prepared a final briefing for the Turner family. For Sarah and Michael Turner, the news was both devastating and relieving. They finally had a name. They finally had answers. But they also had confirmation of what they had feared in their darkest moments. Eli had not survived. The man responsible was gone, beyond the reach of courts or prison walls. When investigators sat down with the family, they explained everything. They described the forgotten evidence box, the DNA breakthroughs, the interview with Ronald Beach, and the timeline that pointed unmistakably to Thomas's involvement. It was a long conversation, emotional, heavy, and filled with moments where words simply failed. Sarah sat quietly for most of the meeting. She listened intently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Michael, who had always tried to stay strong for his family, broke down halfway through. Their children, now adults with families of their own, tried to process the weight of the truth. They had grown up with this mystery shaping their lives, always wondering, always imagining. When asked how they felt, Sarah said something that stayed with the investigators. "I always believed someone knew the truth. I just didn't know it would take a lifetime for it to be spoken." After the family was informed, the sheriff's office released a public statement announcing the official resolution of the case. The announcement was simple and respectful. It named Thomas Beach as the perpetrator, explained the role of modern DNA technology, and emphasized the dedication of everyone who had worked on the case, both in the 1980s and in the present day. The news spread quickly through Maple Ridge. People who had lived in the town during the 1980s recalled the panic that followed Eli's disappearance, the search parties, and the years of uncertainty that followed. Many were shocked that the man responsible had lived among them, unnoticed, and that his name had never surfaced during the original investigation. Others expressed a different emotion, quiet relief. For decades, the disappearance of Eli Turner had been a lingering wound in the community, a painful reminder of vulnerability, loss, and unanswered questions. The resolution didn't erase the tragedy, but it offered something Maple Ridge hadn't had in a long time: closure. Investigators also held a small press briefing to honor the original detective, Rob Ackerman, who had passed away years earlier. Although he never solved the case, his early notes, interviews, and evidence collection had paved the way for the modern breakthrough. The cold case team credited him for preserving the material that ultimately led to the truth. Shortly after the case was closed, the Turners organized a small private memorial for Eli. It wasn't meant to mourn his death again. They had done that silently for decades. Instead, it was meant to honor the life he lived, however short. Family members shared stories, photographs, and memories that had begun to fade, but were now brought back into the light. Neighbors who had known the Turners in the 1980s attended. Some of Eli's childhood friends, now middle-aged, came as well. It was a quiet gathering, filled with both laughter and tears. The memorial wasn't about the man who took Eli. It was about the boy he had been. With the case officially closed, the sheriff's office placed the file back into storage. This time, however, it wasn't unfinished business. It was a finished chapter, a long-awaited conclusion. The Turners finally had answers. Maple Ridge finally had closure. And the name of the man responsible, once lost to time, was recorded permanently in the case file. Justice didn't come in the form of a trial or a conviction, but it came in the form of truth. And after nearly 40 years, that truth was enough. The story of Eli Turner is not just a case file or a headline from the past. It is a reminder of how fragile life can be, how quickly the ordinary can become unimaginable, and how long the shadows of unanswered questions can stretch across a family's life. For nearly 40 years, the Turner family lived in a space between hope and heartbreak. They woke up every day not knowing what happened to their son. They carried memories of a bright, curious child who loved dinosaurs and baseball cards while trying to make sense of a world that had taken him away without explanation. The passage of time softened some wounds, but it never erased the ache. When the truth finally emerged, it didn't bring celebration. There was no sense of victory. Instead, it brought clarity, a quiet, heavy clarity that allowed the Turner family to finally breathe after decades of suffocating uncertainty. Thomas Beach will never face a courtroom. He will never stand before a judge. He will never explain what he did or why he did it. But his anonymity, the shield that allowed him to hide in plain sight for so many years, is gone. The truth has a way of finding its own voice, even when the people who committed the crime cannot be held accountable. Eli's story also highlights the importance of persistence, from investigators who refuse to let a case fade, from family members who never give up on finding answers, and from communities that choose to remember rather than forget. It shows how a single piece of evidence, overlooked for decades, can become the key to unlocking a mystery. And it reminds us how advances in technology can breathe new life into cases long considered unsolvable. Maple Ridge is not the same place it was in 1984. The town has grown, changed, and moved forward. But the memory of Eli remains woven into its history. His disappearance shaped a generation of parents. It reshaped how the community viewed safety, trust, and the fragility of innocence. Today, Eli is remembered not for the tragedy that took him away, but for the life he lived, a boy full of curiosity, laughter, and imagination. A child whose story touched far more people than he ever knew. The closure of this case does not mark an end, but a beginning, the start of healing, the return of peace, and the chance for the Turner family to finally let go of the unanswered questions that haunted them for so long. And for those who hear Eli's story now, it becomes something else entirely. A reminder of why every missing child deserves to be found, why every clue matters, and why justice, even delayed by decades, still matters. The truth came late, but it came. And with that truth, the memory of Eli Turner finally finds its place. Not in mystery, but in remembrance. Not in fear, but in closure. Not in darkness, but in the light he brought to the people who loved him. This is the end of the case. But it is not the end of Eli's story. His story lives on in the hearts of those who never stop searching for him.